It is Thursday afternoon, November 18, 1993. St. Ann, Missouri. A suburb so quiet that parents don't think twice about letting their children walk 8 houses home from the bus stop. A neighborhood of tidy lawns and familiar faces where everybody knows everybody and nothing bad ever happens. The school bus pulls up. The door is open. A 9-year-old girl steps off into the cold November air. She has brown hair and a smile that her teachers say could light up an entire classroom. She is wearing her coat. She has her backpack. She knows exactly where she is going. Home is right there, just 8 houses down the street. Her friends watch her walk. They see her pass the first house, the second, the third, the fourth, and then she is gone. Not in the way missing children usually go missing, not a runaway, not a custody dispute, not a teenager who slipped away in the night. One moment, Angie Housman is walking down her own street in broad daylight. The next moment, she has simply ceased to exist. She was 9 years old. She was 100 feet from her front door. And the man who took her? He had already been convicted of doing this before. He had a court-martial on his record. He had 2 Missouri arrests on his record. He had family living 3 blocks from the school Angie attended every single day. He told investigators 26 years later that Angie Housman was a stranger to him. But here's the question that this case cannot answer. The question that should have been asked in 1993. The question that nobody, not one investigator, not one database, not one agency, thought to ask for over 2 decades. If she was a stranger to him, how did he find her? Angela Marie Housman was born on February 18, 1984, in St. Louis, Missouri. From the very beginning, the people who knew her described her the same way, with an almost helpless affection, like she was simply too full of life for any one description to contain her. She was outgoing in a way that went beyond just being a talkative kid. Angie had a genuine interest in other people. She wanted to know your name. She wanted to know if you were okay. Her teachers at Butter Elementary School, the school she attended every day in the St. Ann suburb where her family lived, talked about her the way teachers talk about the students who stay with them their entire careers. She was the kind of child who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. She had a phrase she used when she met someone new, a habit, really. She would walk right up to them, stranger or not, and she would say, "Hi, I'm Angie." Just like that, no hesitation, no shyness, as if the idea that another person might not want to be her friend was simply beyond her understanding. She was 9 years old, and she already wanted to be a nurse's aide when she grew up. Not because anyone told her to want that, but because Angie noticed when people were hurting, and her instinct was always to help. Her family lived in St. Ann, a suburb of St. Louis that sits just west of the city proper. In 1993, St. Ann was the kind of place that American suburbs were built to be. Modest homes, tree-lined streets, parents who left their front doors unlocked and let their children play until the streetlights came on. It was not a wealthy area, and it was not a flashy one, but it was a community, the kind of place where your neighbors knew your children's names, where the school bus route was as familiar as the back of your hand, and where the idea of something terrible happening to a child on her own street in the middle of the afternoon was genuinely unthinkable. That ordinariness is important, because one of the things that made Angie's disappearance so devastating, so deeply disorienting to the people of St. Ann, was that it happened in exactly the kind of place where it was not supposed to happen. Angie's mother was Diane Housman. By 1993, Diane had remarried, and Angie's stepfather was Ronald Bone, a man who by all accounts loved Angie deeply. The family was tight-knit. Angie was the kind of child who came home from school ready to talk, ready to tell you everything about her day, ready to fill whatever room she walked into with noise and warmth and the particular energy of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned that the world can be a dangerous place.
Every school day, Angie rode the bus home from Butter Elementary. The bus stop was 8 houses from her front door. 8 houses, on a street she had walked 100 times. And on most days, there were parents out on the street watching the children walk home from the stop, a quiet, informal arrangement that the neighborhood had developed over time. An extra set of eyes, an extra layer of safety. On November 18, 1993, those parents were not outside. They were inside. Nobody's fault. Just the ordinary variability of daily life. Someone had something to do. Someone was making dinner. Someone stepped away from the window for 5 minutes. 5 minutes was all it took. Angie stepped off the bus at approximately 3:50 in the afternoon. Her friends watched her walk. They saw her pass 4 houses, and then their attention drifted, the way children's attention drifts. And when they looked back, Angie was gone. Half an hour later, she had not come home. Her parents stepped outside and began to call her name.
When Angie's parents realized she was not coming home on her own, they did what any parent would do. They searched. They went door to door. They called her friends. They walked the route from the bus stop to the house over and over, as if somehow they had missed her, as if she might be crouched behind a hedge playing a game, laughing at how worried everyone was. She was not there. By the time evening fell over St. Anne, the St. Anne Police Department had been called, and within hours, what had begun as a worried family searching for a missing child became something far larger and far more frightening. The Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, a regional law enforcement task force assembled for exactly these situations, was activated on November 22nd, 4 days after Angie vanished. Their job was to do everything that local police resources could not do alone. Canvass the neighborhood systematically, follow every lead, interview every witness, and find a 9-year-old girl who had disappeared in front of witnesses on a sunny November afternoon. The commander of the Major Case Squad at the time was Robert Lowry, Jr., and Lowry said something to the press during those early days that has stayed with everyone who covered this case. He said, "I've never seen anything like it. A little girl gets off of the school bus and she's 100 feet from her house and disappears into thin air. I don't understand it." 100 feet from her house. That detail, that specific terrible detail, became the headline that ran in every St. Louis newspaper, on every local news broadcast, in every conversation at every kitchen table in the region. 100 feet. The length of a basketball court, the distance a child could cover in seconds. What investigators knew from the witnesses at the bus stop was limited but specific. Angie had been seen walking in the right direction. She had passed 4 houses, and then she was simply gone. There were no screams reported, no sounds of a struggle, no witnesses who had seen a car stop or a door open or a stranger approach. Which meant one of 2 things. Either it happened so fast that no one saw it, or the person who took Angie was someone she approached willingly. And that second possibility, given everything we now know about Angie's personality, about a 9-year-old girl who walked up to strangers and said, "Hi, I'm Angie," that possibility became the thread that investigators would pull on for years without ever finding the other end. The search expanded. Hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement officers in combing the neighborhood. Tips flooded in. The Major Case Squad followed every one of them. Dead end after dead end. Days passed. Thanksgiving approached, and with it, the increasingly grim acknowledgement that the longer a missing child search goes on without a discovery, the harder the eventual discovery becomes to bear. On November 27th, 9 days after Angie stepped off that school bus, 2 deer hunters were moving through the August A. Busch Wildlife Conservation Area in St. Charles County, a remote, heavily wooded stretch of land approximately 20 miles west of St. Anne, and in the trees, they found her. Angie Housman was bound to a tree. She was handcuffed. Her head was wrapped in duct tape, covering her eyes, covering her mouth, leaving only her nose exposed. She was partially nude. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been left there alive.
St. Charles County prosecutor Tim Lomark, who would eventually lead the case to its resolution 26 years later, described what investigators determined about Angie's final hours with a quiet, measured horror that said more than dramatic language ever could. She was dehydrated. She was malnourished. The temperatures in that wildlife area had dropped below freezing, and the evidence at the scene, the marks on her wrists, the position of her body, showed that Angie had fought. She had tried to free herself. She had not given up. The official cause of death was hypothermia. She died of exposure. She was alive when she was tied to that tree, and she was alive hours later when she died alone in the freezing cold of a Missouri November. She was 9 years old. She had been missing for 9 days, and the man who did this to her, the man who was already in the system, already flagged, already documented, drove away and left no obvious trace. What happened next is the part of this story that most coverage glosses over. The arrest, the DNA, the confession, those are the headlines. But the 26 years between Angie's murder and Earl Cox's arrest, that is where the real story lives. Because here is what you need to understand about the investigation into Angie Housman's murder, not just as a tragedy, but as a systemic failure. The investigation was not lazy. The investigators were not incompetent. The major case squad generated thousands of leads. Detectives worked this case for years, some of them for decades, carrying it with them the way investigators carry the ones that stay unsolved. Men who lost sleep over it. Men who thought about Angie on Thanksgiving because that was when she was found. The failure here was not one of effort or of character. The failure was structural, and it was catastrophic.
Let me walk you through what the system knew about Earl Webster Cox and when it knew it. Earl Webster Cox was born and raised in the St. Louis area. In 1975, at the age of roughly 17, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. He was assigned to Rhein-Main Air Base in Frankfurt, Germany, where he worked as a computer operator. And it was there, in Germany, while stationed on a United States military base, that Cox began to abuse children. He babysat for families on the base. 4 children, girls aged between 7 and 11, were sexually molested by Earl Cox while they were in his care. He was caught. He was court-martialed in 1980. He was convicted. He was dishonorably discharged from the United States Air Force, and he was sentenced to 8 years at Fort Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. 8 years for 4 child victims. He was paroled in 1985. He came home to St. Louis. Now, stop here for a moment, because in 1985, when Earl Cox walked out of Fort Leavenworth with a dishonorable discharge and a court-martial conviction for child sexual abuse, he was a documented, convicted predator re-entering civilian life in the exact metropolitan area where he grew up, where his family lived, where, according to records that would later be confirmed, his relatives lived in the vicinity of at least one St. Anne neighborhood. What happened next should alarm you. In October 1989, 4 years after his release, Cox was investigated and charged in Overland, Missouri. Overland borders St. Anne. The incident involved 2 7-year-old girls. Cox had taken them to a movie and then to Mort Jacobs Park, a park located directly south of Busch Elementary School, the school that Angie Housman attended. He took 2 7-year-old girls to the park directly behind Angie's school, 4 years before Angie disappeared.
He was charged, but because of jurisdictional and procedural circumstances, those charges did not result in a new conviction. What they did result in was the revocation of his parole for the Germany offenses, and Cox was returned to Fort Leavenworth. From January to December 1992, Earl Cox was in federal custody. That is 11 months. 11 months in which he was incarcerated, documented, and known to the system. He was released in December 1992. 11 months later, in November 1993, Angie Housman was taken from her street. Cox had moved to the St. Anne area after his December 1992 release. His family had connections near Butte Elementary, the same school, the same neighborhood, the same streets. He had been in federal custody 11 months before the murder. He had been charged with offenses involving children in the same geography 4 years before the murder. He had a court-martial conviction on his record from 1980. And yet, when investigators began building their list of persons of interest in the Angie Housman case, Earl Webster Cox's name did not appear on it. Not in 1993, not in 1994, not in any of the years that followed. Why? Because the systems that were supposed to connect those dots did not exist in the way we assumed they did. In 1993, there was no centralized national database that would have allowed a local St. Anne detective to run Cox's name and instantly see his Germany conviction, his 1989 Overland charges, and his recent release from federal custody. The internet was not what it is today. Criminal databases were siloed. Federal records did not automatically talk to state records did not automatically talk to county records. An investigator would have had to specifically know to look for Cox and specifically know which jurisdictions to query to find what the system already knew about him. St. Charles County prosecutor Tim Lomar acknowledged this directly when charges were finally announced in 2019. Communication among various law enforcement agencies, he said, suffered deeply in the days before the internet and online criminal databases. He was not making excuses. He was describing a documented reality of how law enforcement worked in 1993. But here is the thing about that explanation. It is accurate, and it is also insufficient. Because the question is not only why Cox was missed in the chaotic early days of the investigation, the question is why he was still being missed years later, a decade later, 2 decades later.
Because by the time the internet existed, by the time databases were connected, by the time CODIS was operational and expanding, Earl Cox was back in the system for entirely different reasons. In the late 1990s, while living in Colorado, Cox became a major figure in an international online child pornography network called the Shadows Brotherhood. In January 2003, in an FBI sting operation, Cox arranged a meeting with someone he believed to be a 14-year-old girl, someone he had invited to become, in his own words, his sex slave. It was an undercover federal agent. Cox was arrested. Police seized his computer. On it, they found more than 45,000 images of child pornography. The subsequent investigation into the Shadows Brotherhood led to the arrest of approximately 60 people across 11 countries. Cox pleaded guilty in 2003 to attempting to entice a minor across state lines and to possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He finished that sentence, but the federal government was not done with him. In 2012, under the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, a federal court certified Earl Webster Cox as a sexually dangerous person, a legal designation meaning that the government had proven in court that Cox would commit violent sexual attacks on children if he were ever released. He remained in federal custody at FCI Butner Medium I in Butner, North Carolina, not as a prisoner serving a sentence, but as a patient in a federal facility for sexual predators. This is the man who, as of 2018, had not been connected to Angie Housman's murder. A court-martialed sex offender, a man charged with offenses near Angie's school 4 years before her murder, a man released from federal custody 11 months before Angie disappeared, a man whose family lived in the same area where Angie was taken, a man who was at that moment sitting in a federal facility for sexually dangerous persons, because the government had determined that he was a violent predator who could never be safely released. And still, his name had not come up.
Well, Earl Cox moved through the federal system, through his pornography conviction, through his Shadows Brotherhood arrest, through his sexually dangerous person designation. The Housman family lived in the silence of an unsolved case. Diane Housman, Angie's mother, spent years looking for answers. She attended grief support groups. She spoke to investigators.
She held on to the hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually find the person who had taken her daughter and left her in the woods to die alone. One of the people Diane met at those grief groups was a woman named Klingler, who had herself lost a child. Klingler later described meeting Diane for the first time in December 1993, just weeks after Angie's body was found. She said she could still see the look on Diane's face, the way someone can be physically present in a room but simply not be there at all. The particular blankness of a grief so total that the body keeps functioning while everything inside it has stopped. Diane Housman lived with that grief for over 20 years. She was still living with it in 2016 when she died of cancer without ever knowing who had killed her daughter. She never got to sit in that courtroom. She never got to look him in the face. She never got to hear him say it. Ron Bone, Angie's stepfather, has spoken publicly about the weight of those years. The anniversary every November. The Thanksgiving that can never be fully separated from the image of two hunters walking through a wildlife area and finding a little girl tied to a tree covered in snow. The brother that Angie never got to meet, Ronald Bone Jr., who was just 2 years old when his sister was taken and who was grown up in the shadow of a case file. For the investigators, too, the years accumulated in a particular way. Cases go cold not with a decisive moment, but with a gradual fading. Leads run out, task forces disband. The investigators who worked the case the hardest move to other assignments or retire, or carry it privately for the rest of their careers. The Housman case never officially closed, but the active investigation inevitably slowed. There was simply nowhere left to go with the technology available.
What everyone was waiting for, though they did not know it yet, was the science to catch up. To understand what happened in 2018 and 2019, to understand how Earl Cox was finally identified, you need to understand something about the state of forensic DNA science in 1993 versus what it had become 25 years later. When Angie's body was found in November 1993, investigators collected evidence from the scene and from her body with the best tools they had. DNA analysis existed. The FBI had been using it in criminal investigations since the late 1980s, but the technology in 1993 was primitive by modern standards. It required significantly larger and cleaner samples than what is required today, and it was nowhere near sensitive enough to analyze degraded or trace amounts of biological material. The evidence collected from Angie's clothing and body was preserved. This is the part that matters. The investigators who worked this case in 1993 did something right that would eventually make all the difference. They kept everything. They did not discard samples that could not be analyzed at the time. They sealed them, stored them, and left them for a future that they could not fully imagine but believed in. That evidence sat in storage for 25 years. By 2018, the St. Charles County investigators who had inherited the Housman case decided it was time for another attempt. Forensic technology had advanced so dramatically since 1993 that evidence which had once yielded nothing was now capable of producing a complete DNA profile from a biological sample too small to see with the naked eye. The piece of evidence they sent to the lab was a fragment of Angie's underwear, a torn piece, used, as Lomar would later describe it, as a gag. The biological material on this fragment was minimal. It was degraded by 25 years of storage. It was, by any reasonable 1993 standard, completely unworkable. In February 2019, the forensic lab returned their results. The fragment, a scrap of fabric about the size of a pea, had yielded DNA profiles belonging to 2 individuals. One of them was Angie Housman. The other was an unknown male. That unknown male profile was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. CODIS is the FBI's national DNA database, which, at the time of this investigation, contained profiles from convicted offenders across all 50 states, as well as profiles from unsolved cases. It is an automated system. Once a profile is submitted, it is compared algorithmically against every profile in the database. The comparison takes far less time than it once would have, and this time there was a match. The unknown male profile from a 25-year-old scrap of fabric the size of a pea matched the profile of a man already in federal custody in North Carolina. Earl Webster Cox.
The statistical probability of this being a coincidence was not merely remote, it was effectively impossible. The match was 1 in 58.1 trillion. There are approximately 7.5 billion people on Earth. The probability of finding another person with a matching profile was a number so large it exists outside the range of ordinary human comprehension. When investigators understood what they were looking at, when the number resolved itself into a name, and that name resolved itself into a face and a history and an address, they wept. Multiple investigators on the case have said publicly that when they realized the 26-year search was over, they cried. They ran the name, and what came back was everything that should have been there from the beginning. A court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, a 1989 arrest in Overland, connected to a park directly behind Butter Elementary School, a 1992 release from federal custody, a 2003 federal conviction, and a current address inside a federal facility for sexually dangerous persons where the government was already holding him because they knew what he was capable of. He had never been a ghost. He had never truly hidden. He was in the system the entire time, multiple systems, multiple jurisdictions, multiple convictions and arrests and designations. The system had simply never connected the dots until a piece of fabric the size of a pea finally forced it to.
Now, I want to come back to something I said at the very beginning of this video. He told investigators that Angie Housman was a stranger to him. And here is what the record shows. Cox was living in the Ferguson area of St. Louis at the time of Angie's murder. His relatives lived near Butter Elementary, the school Angie attended. In 1989, 4 years before Angie disappeared, Cox had taken 2 7-year-old girls to a park immediately behind that same school. He knew that geography. He had been in that geography with young children before. He had been charged for what he did to those children in that geography. Was Angie a stranger? Perhaps in the narrowest technical sense. Perhaps Cox had not met her specifically before. But the neighborhood was not a stranger to him. The school was not a stranger to him. The bus route, the streets, the patterns of children walking home in the afternoon, none of that was strange to Earl Cox. And yet, and this is the part that I want you to sit with, the official account of how this happened relies on a version of events that Cox himself offered in his eventual guilty plea. He said he was driving to a sister's house on the afternoon of November 18, 1993. He said he had car trouble. He said he stopped. He saw the school bus. He saw Angie. He said it was chance. Prosecutor Lomar did not explicitly dispute this account when Cox entered his plea, but let me ask you the question that the cold file is here to ask. A man with a documented history of preying on children near Butter Elementary, a man who had been to that park, those streets, that neighborhood before, happens to have car trouble on the exact afternoon that a 9-year-old girl is walking home alone from that school. Chance. You can decide what you think about that word. What is not chance, what is documented fact, is that the system that was supposed to protect Angie from men like Earl Cox had every piece of information it needed to flag him, to investigate him, to, at minimum, put his name on a list in 1993, and it did not. The databases were siloed. The jurisdictions didn't communicate.
The federal record didn't automatically inform the county investigation, and a man who had already been convicted of molesting 4 children, arrested for molesting 2 more, and released from federal custody 11 months before Angie's murder, walked freely through a gap in the system that no one in 1993 or in the years that followed knew was large enough to lose a killer through. That gap is not ancient history. The lesson of Angie Housman is not simply about one monster who was eventually caught. It is about what happens when systems designed to protect children fail to speak to each other, and about what the cost of that silence looks like when it has a name and a face and a 4th grade class photo. On June 5, 2019, St. Charles County Prosecutor Tim Lomar stood before cameras and microphones outside the St. Charles County Police Department and announced that Earl Webster Cox, aged 61, sitting in a federal facility in North Carolina, had been charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and sodomy in the death of Angie Housman. The community that had carried this case for 26 years exhaled. And then they waited again. Cox was extradited to Missouri. He appeared in court. He initially entered a not guilty plea, the procedural reflex of a defendant who had spent decades navigating the criminal justice system. But the evidence against him was not complicated. It was a scrap of fabric, a DNA profile, and a ratio of 1 in 58.1 trillion. There was no plausible defense. In August 2020, 27 years after Angie Housman stepped off a school bus and never made it home, Earl Webster Cox stood in a St. Charles County courtroom and pleaded guilty. First-degree murder, child molestation. He was 63 years old. He answered the judge's questions in what courtroom observers described as a matter-of-fact manner. Not remorseful, not dramatic, simply answering questions with the practiced flatness of a man who had been through courtrooms before. He described, in the clinical language of a guilty plea, what he had done. He said he saw the school bus stop. He said he saw Angie. He said she was cold and tired. He said she got into his car. He drove her away from her street, away from her home that was 100 feet away, and he took her to Wentzville, where he was renting a mobile home in St. Charles County. He held her there. He sexually abused her. He kept her captive for days, and then, when he was done, he drove her into the August A. Busch Wildlife Conservation Area, to a remote spot approximately 5 to 6 miles from where he had been holding her, and he bound her to a tree, and he walked away. He suggested in his account that he had left her hoping someone would find her.
Prosecutor Lomar did not believe that. His theory, and given the remoteness of the location, it is a credible one, was that Cox believed that in a location that isolated, in November cold, with no witnesses and no clear trail back to him, the body would either not be found or would be so decomposed by the time it was found that identification would be impossible, that the evidence would be gone. He was wrong about that. Not because the evidence was found immediately, it was found 9 days later by 2 hunters in a wildlife area 20 miles from St. Anne, but because the investigators who processed that scene in 1993 preserved what they found. They kept a scrap of fabric the size of a pea in an evidence box for 26 years. And when the technology finally existed to read what that scrap contained, it read his name. Under the terms of the guilty plea, Cox would not face the death penalty. Some members of Angie's family were not satisfied with that outcome. They had waited 27 years for this moment, and they wanted the full weight of the law to fall on the man who had taken everything from them. Their grief was entitled to that want. But the family did come to court. Several of Angie's relatives delivered victim impact statements. Angie's cousin Melanie Martin told the judge that she still has nightmares, that she cries every time she thinks about what Angie went through.
Another family member, Angie's aunt Sandra Hill, found a way to reach for something like peace. She said that Angie and Diane, Angie's mother, who had died without ever knowing, were in heaven, looking down on all of them, smiling. Ronald Bone Jr., Angie's little brother, who was 2 years old when she disappeared and who had grown up knowing her only through photographs and stories, stood outside the courthouse afterward and spoke to the press. He was 29 years old. He had never known his sister, and yet he was there, bearing the weight of a loss he had inherited before he was old enough to understand it. Earl Webster Cox was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would not be executed. He would not be released. He would live out whatever years remained to him inside a Missouri prison, not as a patient in a rehabilitation facility, not as a federal designee, but as what he had always been, a convicted murderer. As it turned out, those years were not many. On December 2, 2024, 4 years after his sentencing, Earl Webster Cox was taken to Missouri Delta Medical Center, where he died that night. He was 67 years old. He is gone, and the questions he took with him about what he knew, about whether anyone else was involved, about the full scope of what he did, will remain unanswered.